Well, for some, those festivities are all about parades and parties, but others say it's time to get back to Pride's political roots. For more on this conversation, we're joined by historian Tom Hooper in Toronto. Tom, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me this morning.
Pride, of course, known as a big celebration. Hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets. Love is love. Very positive for the community. But it began, and it's worth remembering and reminding another generation that it began in reaction to over-policing in queer communities with Stonewall in the early 70s in New York, and then in Toronto with the bathhouse raids in the early 80s. Do you think that that history is represented in today's Pride festivities?
No, I don't see it. I don't see it represented in our Pride festivities at all. Pride is a protest. As you mentioned, it was a movement formed out of the police raids in June 1969 on the Stonewall Inn in New York City. And here in Canada, it was formed from similar attacks, be it in 1977, the police raid on the Trucks Bar in Montreal, or, as you mentioned, the 1981 Toronto bathhouse raids. Pride was a defiant statement saying we were not going to accept these kinds of attacks. And Pride organizations across the country have lost sight of this history. We don't see this protest for justice. Instead, what we see are corporations and politicians using Pride festivals as a marketing platform. And this has brought a disconnect between our Pride institutions and our communities. And I think Pride Toronto is an excellent example of that.
Can we talk then about the messaging where a community that was denied its rights for so long is now much more included in society, and it's about being inclusive and accepted. And yet you're talking about potentially reminding people of division. So how do you square that circle?
Well, the protest was never about inclusion. We were never saying, okay, in 1981, we want cops and politicians to be taking over our Pride parade. This is not about celebrating, although celebration's a key point. We have to celebrate the victories that our communities have gained over the years. But what about the people who are still left out, the people who are still marginalized? Just last week, we had Toronto police apologizing to the Black community for their widespread use of strip searching. Why isn't Pride at the forefront of that battle? That's where it should be.
So how do you, as you're arguing for effectively, are you asking to turn the juggernaut around and to make it an entirely different celebration, or do you want the history that you're talking about just recognized in a more obvious way?
Well, I think Pride needs to be reclaimed by our communities. There's no rule that says that Pride has to be this forever expanding corporate enterprise. The first Pride festivals were created by a handful of activists who went around passing out flyers. We can do that again today. In fact, in Toronto, there is an alternate Pride celebration happening. At 11 a.m., activists will gather at Queen and Bay Streets and will march to various historic sites throughout the city, including 52 Division, the police station that was responsible for the 1981 bathhouse raids. So I think a different way of doing Pride is possible. We're not forced to celebrate the corporations and the politicians.
It has been over 40 years. It's, I think, fair to say that a whole generation of young LGBTQ people have grown up, perhaps not as aware of the history that you're talking about. What do people celebrating in whatever way they celebrate today, what do they need to know?
Well, I think, they need to know that Pride has been co-opted. It's been taken over by these interests. I'll give you an example. Over the last 3 years, Pride Toronto received a series of federal grants worth $1.85 million. And I learned from doing access to information requests that the projects they proposed were never delivered, yet they still received the money. As part of this, they submitted fake letters of support from Indigenous community organizations like the Assembly of First Nations. They submitted another grant report claiming a fully executed contract with world-famous Cree artist Kent Monkman. These were all faked, and yet Pride Toronto used these claims in order to receive these federal funds. I think this shows a huge disconnect between these institutions and our communities, and how the Pride organizations, they're after money. And they don't care if they're going to sell it to the corporations to get it or to the politicians to get it. This is a message I think young people need to hear, that this is not, what we have today is not what Pride was supposed to be about.
And just to underline what you were saying, Pride Toronto subsequently apologized after a review, not a full audit, but a review was held, saying it wasn't transparent with the granting process that it was part in. One final question before I let you go. How are you going to celebrate Pride today?
Well, I mean, I will say Pride apologized, but only after my report came out. They apologized because they got caught. They would have been more than happy to keep this grant scandal secret, and we can understand why. If they had to actually face consequences for what happened here, it might destroy the organization. For me, I will be at the Alternative Pride March. I will be downtown at 11 a.m. Marching with activists and our communities in an effort to try to reclaim Pride. I hope a lot of people will join me in that.
Tom Hooper, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Historian Tom Hooper. You're watching CBC News Network.